So here we are at the first fork in the road of the Via Papelis, the Possessor route. We're in front of the building known as the Zecca, the Mint, that was built under Pope Leo X. Now, when Leo was elected Pope, he staged an elaborate Possessor, maybe the most elaborate one of all time until his time. At this fork in the road, which is an intersection of what was the Via dei Banchi Vecchi, the old banks, coming this way, which was also an extension of the Pilgrim's route, the Via del Pellegrino, and this Via dei Banchi Nuovi, the new banks, heading off this way, which is really the Via Papelis. At that intersection, Leo had set up two triumphal arches, temporary ephemeral structures that were meant to symbolize his virtues and the agendas of his papacy. So having done that, he essentially was marking two critical points of transition and treating them as almost equivalent options, and he has to pick one. He has to choose. This idea of the fork in the road as a choice that can be read almost in an allegorical or moralizing way was an important part of the route that we'll see again and again as we move through the route. So the Zecca was built later, built after his Possessor. But the interesting thing that I also want to talk about here is the way in which the Possessor both had to respond to the existing street conditions and the architecture, and it therefore left residue afterwards that shaped those streets, that the sometimes temporary structures that were erected for the Possessor later became permanent structures or influenced permanent buildings along the route. So at this first fork in the road, the Pope is essentially presented with a choice. Down this way is the papal route, the Via dei Banchi Nuovi. This way is the Pilgrim's route, the Via del Pellegrino, which in its latter stretch is now known as the Via dei Banchi Vecchi, the old banks. The Pope had to go down this route because he's the Bishop of Rome. Being the Bishop of Rome, he's essentially also in residence, or his seat is at the Lateran. And having his seat at the Lateran means going through the whole city in order to take possession of it as bishop. Okay? So he has to actually pass through this difficult neighborhood, a neighborhood filled with warring baronial families, many of them rivals for the papacy. Those rivals are people who have bastions, towers, palaces, precincts, and he has to pass through that neighborhood in a way to confront them and to weave them into his papal structure. In order to do that, he's got to essentially process past them and show them his papacy. And his papacy has to weave them into it as a kind of participant, and that they buy into it, essentially. So he has to deal with this difficult neighborhood. It's the only left choice on the Possessor route. It's the only time when he's going to have to turn down into this difficult neighborhood. Later on down the route, he's going to make a series of right-hand choices, and the route will get essentially grander and grander in its later stretches. So passing down in this left route is his difficult journey, his arduous passage in order to move on to the greater and grander parts of the Possessor route. So here at the fork in the road, Leo sets up two triumphal arches, temporary triumphal arches, one framing that street, the other framing the Via del Pellegrino. Now the interesting thing again about those temporary constructions is the way they influence permanent buildings. And as I said, these streets were called the Banchi. Now the Banchi referred to bankers and banks. And even our word bank really comes from a kind of a table. And what the Banchi were in their simplest sense, simply money-changing tables. As all the pilgrims approached St. Peter's, they were coming from all over the known world, and they all had their own currency. And if they're going to make offerings or donations at St. Peter's, they had to make them in the local currency. And so here they would be making basically money changes, essentially exchanging one currency for another. But the bankers were also powerful, wealthy families who were lenders to the papacy often for things like the Possessor. The Pope often had to borrow money in order to stage these elaborate processions, or to fight wars, or to do lots of other things like build buildings. So these Banchi were essential to the papacy, but they're on the, if you like, the secular side of the river. Remember, if the idea is that the Vatican and the Borgo Leonino represents the city of God, we're very much here in the city of man. And so quite deliberately, all of the sort of dirty money that has to exchange hands here takes place on this side of the river. The Banchi Vecchi are the older banks, the older families that had set up banks here. Banchi Nuovi, some of the newer banks, many of them Tuscans like Leo himself. So at this fork in the road, he's presented with two choices. He chooses the left path. He's going to go down that difficult route through the heart of the Abitato and the heart of the warring baronial families. What happened, though, is that that image of those triumphal arches, which created more of the sense of a kind of tragic stage, the sense in which the city was becoming a theater, and a tragic theater, a classical one by that sense. that memory of those triumphal arches found their way onto the Zecca, the mint building that he had built here, which makes a lot of sense, the mint being built right in the heart of all the banks. And the mint building, designed by Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, is essentially a permanent version of those triumphal arches. What made a triumphal arch for the ancient Romans and for the Renaissance was a large central arched passage flanked by columns or pilasters, and often with secondary side passages. So the large central passage for people on horseback, for grand triumphal processions, and sometimes simpler, smaller passages on the side for ordinary people. In this case, that triumphal arch is set one story up and on a rusticated base. Rustications suggest rough, rustic, hard, brutal stuff that is the life of the street, and then what the Italians call the piano nobile. We in America refer to it as the second floor. Europeans refer to it as the first floor, and they would call this the ground floor. That first floor European or second floor American is the piano nobile, the noble floor, up off the dirty life of the street at the kind of noble level. And so that's typically the primary floor of all the palaces of Rome. Down here at the street, it's rough and tumble, it's bustling, it's dirty, and if there is money here being made, it needs to be protected in a kind of vault-like space. So the rustication suggests that idea of protection and defense and the rough life of the street, and the elegant triumphal arch that's made permanent is raised one story up. And it's not an arch that we can pass through. It's been embellished with escutcheons and symbolic devices, but it really suggests that idea, it recalls the memory, if you like, of those triumphal passages that were made here on the Possessor route. So we're looking at a situation where an architectural form, a permanent construction, is built at a critical juncture, just like those two churches of the Piazza del Popolo. And at that juncture, it's also recalling a temporary event, something that happened and disappeared. That temporary event leaves a kind of residue or a memory on the site that eventually architects will make permanent. And so at that site, we're at this point of transition. Now, Sangallo also gave the building a slightly concave form. And what that does is act as a kind of receptor. In a way, we're coming from the Ponte San Angelo. This Zecca receives us and deflects us. It's both, if you like, a kind of catcher's mitt and a deflector that pushes us off to one side. We have to choose between these two forks. Again, pilgrims come this way, popes go that way. And we're going to take the papal route, follow the papal route to its culmination at the Campidoglio before we look off into the distance towards the Lateran. So let's pick up and go. Now, the Possessor route as a procession might have taken a whole day. Now, to walk it, if you're a pilgrim or a tourist today in Rome, at a good clip, you could probably walk from St. Peter's to the Lateran in about an hour. The Possessor route would have taken a whole day. So for us, we're going to make it a real passage. We're going to stop and talk and look and learn about the route along the way. So we need to gear up for this journey. So here we go.